Pick up the 3700X for just $305 on Amazon. For even less, you can get the 2700X for just $220 on Newegg. And if you already have a Ryzen 5000 CPU but need a board, this Gigabyte B550 is $20 off and has USB flashback, so you can update the BIOS without a CPU. If you need an SSD, you can pick up Samsung's 500GB Evo 850 for just $53.99 on Newegg. If you need more storage for your server, this 10TB NAS drive is $40 off. For more memory, this Team T-Force 32GB kit is a fair bit off on Newegg. And of course, there's quite a bit of other deals that you may be interested in, so make sure to check out the sites down in the description below. Next up for today, AMD's 16-core Ryzen 9 5950X just got an all-core overclock of 6.362 GHz by Gigabyte's overclocker HiCookie. What's even more wild is that they got a Cinebench R20 score of 15,517 points, which beats the 28-core Xeon W3175X's stock score, as well as AMD's 24-core 3960X's score. HiCookie was able to achieve the score using liquid nitrogen on Gigabyte's X570 Aorus Master. And obviously the use of liquid nitrogen isn't a surprise, but at over 6 GHz on 16 cores, it's definitely impressive. Lastly for today, I've got a really big story for those interested in AMD's newly released Ryzen 5000 CPUs. For those who've been keeping up with the news, you know that AMD originally stated that only 500 series motherboards would support their Ryzen 5000 CPUs. After enough backlash, they ended up changing it to also supporting 400 series boards, but that the beta BIOS wouldn't come until next year. Still, that's a far cry from no support, though of course 300 series boards are not supported. Or are they? In a new Twitter post by a fairly well-known leaker who shared a screenshot of a Ryzen 9 5900X running on CPU Z with an A320M board, and that's the low-end 300 series board. Not only that, but a few forum users are claiming that 300 series boards can work, with one user on overclock.net who actually stated that they know someone who has a beta BIOS running on an X370GB board. Now, obviously that doesn't necessarily mean it's made by the motherboard maker, but according to WCCF Tech, they're hearing that motherboard makers are giving out support to select 300 series boards, so this could be an official thing, though AMD doesn't seem to be too happy about it. Unfortunately, we haven't heard anything official yet, and it doesn't seem all 300 series boards will get it. But of course, as that information comes through, I'll make sure to give that out. In the meantime, beta BIOS updates seem to already be going live for 400 series boards. Gigabyte actually released support for some B450 boards, though it looks like they have since taken them down. Still, it seems boards will be getting support sooner than we originally thought. Time, as always, will tell. So while that does it for today, are you pumped to get AMD's Ryzen 5000 CPUs, or are you kind of holding out to see if your older motherboard can support it? Let me know down in the comments below, and as always, have a great day!
Welcome back to Hardware Unboxed. I am back yet again. I have had a little bit of sleep since you would have seen my 5600X review. But we've got that done now, and of course we've jumped headfirst into other Zen 3 related things. I've started some so there'll be more content coming up, but in between all of that, Tim and I thought we'd have just one of our sort of relaxed, laid back conversations about the whole launch and the products, and basically address a heap of questions that we've got from our Patreon members slash now Floatplane members, I guess.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah, this was all on our Discord. So yeah, that's it. So it's just going to be, we're going to talk about basically the questions that we have been asked by the Patreon slash Floatplane members, but there'll be some other probably conversation in there as well.
I think
a few things have popped up. So we'll just get into it. You guys enjoyed it when we did this last time for the, what was it, the RTX 3070 was the last one we did.
Yeah, that's
that was
right.
quite
Done a
popular.
few of these, yeah.
So anyway, before I waffle on any more, let's get into it.
Let's go. All right, first question here. What price do you think the 5800X will settle to in about 6 months when the buyers settle into the price to performance approach? Interesting discussion, because you found that the 5800X was sort of the worst value of the products, didn't you? So, interesting question.
Yeah, obviously it's a what do you think type thing, so a crystal ball type question. I can't remember what I said in my review, but it needs to be priced a maximum of $400 really to make sense in the current market. 6 months down the track, it depends on what changes there. If Intel makes any adjustments, seems unlikely. Yeah, it's hard to say. It really is, because we also need a 5700X.
Yeah, that's exactly what I was going to say. 5700X, what's happening there?
That's right. So we're looking at about $300-ish for the 3700X, and obviously MSRP is $330. It's come down below that, certainly 6 months after launch, and it sort of comes back up to the release of Zen 3. So hopefully we can get an 8-core CPU with the kind of IPC we're seeing from Zen 3 at around that price point. I think that's what everyone would be hoping for. It's a similar situation really with the 600 non-X that we're also hoping to see. Rumored price of $220 US. If that happens, that is going to be the best seller for next year for sure.
Yep.
That CPU at $220 US is just an absolute bargain. People are going to blame me now for saying that, and AMD is going to adjust prices, but yeah, that's not a thing. So hopefully we do see these lower prices, but of course there'll be, I'm expecting like a second wave of these sort of Zen reviews of the non-X models. So I'm hoping we do see either a 58 non-X or a 57 100X or whatever it may be there, and then of course the 56 non-X. But anyway,
it's really stuck in one of those. It's kind of like the mid-range situation that we've seen a few times. Like 10700K, for example, was kind of, well, 10700K was sort of the value gaming choice from the Intel side. And then if you really wanted the best, then you wouldn't buy the 10700K. You go all the way up to the 10900K. And you're getting a very similar thing here, because it's not really like a lot of creators, I guess, would use a 5800X type product. Because if you're going all out on productivity, then you just go right up to 5900X or something like that. So really you're stuck in that very difficult position. So yeah, I think there's a lot to play out here, and hopefully, as you say, we'll get some more chips to sort of slot in around here and improve that situation.
Yeah, definitely. It'll be one of those things where the market dictates what happens. If it's a situation where early next year AMD is still rapidly selling everything they can pump out, then they're not going to be incentivized to make it cheaper, more affordable parts based on the same silicon, really. And they'll probably be they're definitely binning silicon at this point. So there'll be some 58, well, there'll be some 8-core dies, for example, that won't clock maybe as well, and they'll be getting binned for the future, cheaper, more affordable parts, let's say.
Yep.
But anyway, we'll have to wait and see on that one. All right, next question here. This one got quite a few thumbs up in the Discord chat, so obviously a few people want this one addressed. With Ryzen 5000 CPUs running slightly cooler for both the CPU and VRM, they're using slightly less power sometimes, would a not-so-great X570 and B550 motherboards be alright to run higher-tier CPUs, 8 or 12 core? I honestly don't think you'll see too much difference. Yeah, they are, depending on which models we're talking about here, they can be slightly more power efficient, slightly easier on the VRM, but I don't think to the degree where a board that, well, let's say MSI Gaming Edge, for example, the X570 Gaming Edge or the Gaming Plus, they were kind of the worst boards we saw. Again, they'll still work perfectly fine with a 12-core CPU for gaming. It's more if you're going to do core-heavy workloads, like a Blender-type workload for extended periods of time, like half an hour. We saw them throttle in that sort of workload without airflow within 5-10 minutes. But if you have airflow, they'll certainly survive a bit longer before throttling the CPU a bit. But I don't expect to see too much difference. Basically, the motherboards that you should have avoided, you still should avoid. And that's that, really.
Yeah, I think with some of those boards, it's kind of like, when they're bad, they're really bad. Like, they're so much worse than the other products. I mean, I'm not an expert motherboard testing, but it doesn't sound like those boards are running very close to the edge. Like, a few watts here or there would be the difference between being able to run those CPUs without throttling and getting throttling. It seems like they're just bad. They're just bad products. So, yeah, I'd agree with what you're saying.
To be fair, there really aren't many boards we're talking about.
Yeah, that's right.
About 3 maybe X570 motherboards. Unfortunately, they all came from MSI. MSI's refreshed some of those boards now, which has addressed those problems. As far as B550 goes, as long as you have a bit of airflow and a 30-degree ambient or lower room temperature, there's no B550 board that won't run any of these CPUs for extended periods of time on quality workloads. So really, they all stepped their game up for B550. All the B550 boards are quite good. I'm talking about any B550 motherboard with a heatsink on the VRM. So just, yeah, if they don't have a heatsink, we didn't bother testing them because they're probably not going to be great for the 12, 16 core models.
Right, next question. Super simple one. Only 3 words. Thoughts on availability?
They're my kind of questions.
I love the short one. It's an interesting one because I think we've seen some commentary sort of comparing the Zen 3 launch to the RTX 3000 series launch. I think it's been sort of that was the talking point going into this. You know, will it be as bad as the Nvidia launch? And it seems pretty clear from user reports, from what we're hearing from retailers as well, that availability is significantly better. Like, it did not sell out in 1 second like the RTX 3080, but it sounded like in a lot of regions actually you could buy chips hours after the launch, especially for stuff like the 5600X, which was pretty good to see.
Yeah, so the 5600X, from all reports I've heard, thousands of those available for order at individual retailers. So plenty of 5600X CPUs. I think the 5800X, not too bad. And then as you get to sort of the 5900X, which it seemed like that was a CPU AMD was pushing, but not quite as good availability at this point in time for that one. And then the 5950X, limited availability there. No real surprises though, because like the 3950X, that had really bad availability for
a while. Yeah.
Up to something like 2 months from memory. And then it just, all of a sudden then it was just, you can buy one now. And the supply caught up with the demand, basically.
Yeah, that's right.
And we're going to see that again here. So I think the default sort of reaction from buyers these days is to lose their minds and scream paper launch from the rooftops. But basically, whenever a new exciting product launches that claims something crazy like a 19% IPC improvement or whatever it may be, they're going to sell out. Like, they're just going to sell out on day one at some point. And I mean, as you say, it didn't necessarily sell out everywhere, but it did in certain places. Retailers may be underordered because they didn't know that the demand would be so high. We've said this, I don't know how many times at this point. You've really got to look 1 to 2 weeks down the track. If you get 2 weeks and it's still really hard to buy, then perhaps there is some kind of supply issue. But yeah, generally speaking, I expect in 2 weeks' time you'll be able to buy at least like the 5900X, the 5800X pretty easily. Not sure about the 5950X, as I said, the 3950X was at least a month, if not 2 months before that was easy to purchase everywhere. And I think with RDNA 2, supply will possibly be worse. That's certainly what the reports sound like. But again, I know it's going to happen anyway. People are going to lose their minds on day one, paper launch, all that sort of stuff. Give it a couple of weeks, and once the crazy, overwhelming demand cools off or people start to get their orders fulfilled, then hopefully it won't be like what we see with the RTX 3080. But maybe it will.
Yeah,
we generally... That's right. We generally call it a month after launch. I think that's a reasonable amount of time for them to get things sorted out and work out how strong the demand is.
Yep. My next question is, and I'm pretty sure Steve will know the answer to this one, is there a new memory sweet spot for Zen 3? Have there been real improvements to FCLK tuning, able to get, say, DDR4 4000 to run 1-to-1? So a couple of thumbs up on that one, so best to your thoughts.
Well, I've started doing a bit of tinkering, as I alluded to at the beginning of this video, doing a bit of memory testing and whatnot. The FCLK 2 GHz, 2000 MHz, not a thing on any of my CPUs, at least on the X570 Godlike. I know AMD's hinted at that being possible. It hasn't been for me yet. So if you leave the FCLK at 1.9 GHz and put the DDR up to 4000, no real improvements there. So it seems, based on my preliminary testing, that the sweet spot is for Zen 3 is the same as Zen 2. So you're looking at like 3800, basically that 1900 megahertz FCLK seems like it's much more achievable, at least with Zen 3. But it's more, I've found, again, tuning those memory timings. So if you're using like 32 is with low latency timing, still pretty good, but 36, 38 with those manually tuned timings, very comparable. So I wouldn't really stress too much about which frequency you're running at. It's more about tuning up those timings again. And as Gamers Nexus released a video talking about 2 sticks versus 4, something we covered in depth in January of this year. Basically, with these Zen processors, it was the same with Zen 2, same with Zen 3. 4 sticks will perform better than 2. And, well, I should say single rank works better than dual rank. So if you have 2 single rank sticks and then you go and get another 2 single rank sticks, that actually changes a 2 dual channel operation. So
you mean dual rank operation, right?
Dual rank operation, yes. So not to be confused with dual channel, because that's still a thing whether you have 2 or 4 sticks providing they're in the right DIMM slots, but you end up with more 64-bit banks to access. And not that they're accessed simultaneously, but you can write to one, the one that you're going to read from next is ready to go, individual banks. So they talk about interleaving and stuff like that. Anyway, it's all covered in a video that we released in January. So we'll probably put a link to that because...
Yeah, we can do that. Yeah, it was a good video that covered the sort of... You want dual rank for gaming, put more sticks in, tends to be better. But you said that potentially quad rank was not... Don't go all the way to quad, but dual is good.
I haven't tested it, so I don't know. I honestly don't know if quad rank's going a step too far and that overwhelms things and you see a bit of a performance decline, or if it's the same or improved. No idea there. So not something we've looked at yet. Perhaps it's something we can look into the future. I just need 2 kits of dual rank memory and I only have 1, so not something I can test at this point in time.
Yeah, just
but anyway, as for... Sorry, go on.
Yeah, I was just going to say, I mean, going back to the memory sweet spot with FCLK, I actually found it surprising that AMD said, you know, you might be able to do 2 gigahertz on it, considering they also said it was the exact same I/O die design. So I was kind of wondering, you know, how would that have been possible? Were they binning it more to try and make that claim? I mean, if it's the same die, surely we're going to get the same memory performance.
Yeah, exactly. Robert was talking about a newer GISA code that was going to make it more likely that you could run the FCLK at 2000 megahertz. Again, none of my chips do it with the current BIOS. I don't know if that'll be a thing, but as I said, 1900 megahertz seems more plausible now, because I had like 1 or 2 CPUs of the many Zen 2 chips I have that could actually do that. There was more, 1800 megahertz was standard typical, so we've gone up at least 100 megahertz there. And it does make a difference, but as I said, it's really all again about those memory timings. Tuning them up does make a really big difference. And again, I'll have a video covering this in more depth soon. But you'll see, if you grab just a pair of 8GB sticks, so a 16GB memory kit, pretty common what people go for, and it's a CL16 kit with some fairly loose timings, the performance decline compared to what we showed in our review is pretty severe. When CPU limited, there is quite a big drop off in performance. I don't know what performance you'll see with an Intel CPU. Maybe that's a separate video we can do where we take all that stuff and then redo it on Intel and do a comparison, because I know people will be begging for that. That's a lot of testing though for one video, and I wouldn't be able to get it out this week. And I know people are really keen because they want to know what memory to buy with their Ryzen processor. It's also, for those of you who want a bit of memory buying advice right now, this is something we always talk about. The reviews and the way we test there isn't necessarily something, or it isn't the hardware configuration you necessarily want to purchase. We're doing a sort of scientific testing, if you will. We're trying to do an apples to apples thing and eliminate certain variables so we can focus on CPU performance. But as I've said in all of my Ryzen 5000 reviews, typically when gaming, you will find yourselves predominantly GPU bound. So you will not be bound by your memory frequency. So keep that in mind. Basically, don't go buying super expensive memory with low latencies that typically is something overclockers would get to get the best scores possible. Under realistic conditions, whether you're using 3200 or 3800, you're probably going to see really no difference in performance. And then where it does become a little more CPU dependent, we're talking about a couple of frames. So spending hundreds more on your memory just doesn't make sense. But anyway, I'll cover this in much more detail in that upcoming video. But yeah, at the moment, 3600 CL16 reasonably priced kit, probably the way to go.
Cool.
So more details to come.
Right, next question here is from Jeremy. Do you believe Zen 3 will be similar to Zen Plus, as in lacking the low-end Ryzen 5 and Ryzen 3, as those were replaced by APUs on those brackets instead? Do you think it's possible that even non-X X600, so like 5600 in this situation, do you reckon that tier will be omitted this time? I think we've talked a bit about how probably the 5600 non-X is going to exist. I think it's very unlikely that they'll just have a $300 CPU and nothing below that. Seems like they will have something there. But for those Ryzen 5 and Ryzen 3 low-end parts, like sort of your quad cores, we know that there's Zen 3 APUs coming up, potentially as early as sort of, first month or first couple of months of 2021. So it could be that they just leave it to that product, which is pretty likely going to be an 8-core die again. So they might even have as much as a Ryzen 7 on an APU design. Yeah, it's a really hard one to say. I mean, do you reckon we'll get like what will it be, a 5300X and 5100 for this generation?
Yeah, like quad core Zen 3 quad cores. Maybe. I mean, we didn't really get quad cores with Zen 2, did we? Yields just weren't bad enough to warrant the existence of those processors. They would be lasering off working dies, essentially, and that's why well, I don't know for a fact, but I'm guessing that's why availability for the 3100 and 3300X was so bad. They spent pretty much the entire generation building enough really defective dies where they only had 4 working cores to be sold as those parts, and they even had to mix and match with the CCDs because different configurations, basically. And yeah, it took a long time for them to come in. They seem to sell out pretty quickly and never properly get restocked. I don't actually know what the availability situation is currently, but last I looked, it wasn't great. So yeah, we may just see sort of like a limited edition quad-core run on Zen 3 halfway through the product cycle, and then that's it. I don't know. But yeah, we're just all guessing. I'm very confident we're going to see a 5600 non-X.
Yeah.
Beyond that, though.
Yeah, so I would say it's probably more likely there'll be APUs, but again, it's just hard to say. I would imagine that they'll have something in that sort of 200 and maybe $150 price range, though. It'd be pretty unusual to stop at 300, as we've sort of said. All right, next question, another one about the value of Zen 3. Considering the price hike of Zen 3 processors compared to Zen 2 processors and the good enough performance that they gave in gaming and already excellent performance in productivity, is it worth the extra money to buy a Zen 3 CPU compared to a Zen 2 option, which will hopefully come down in price as well, excluding time is money? The extra savings could go towards other things like a better GPU, as shown by the 3600 with a quick overclock can match the 10900K at higher resolutions with, I assume this is an RTX 3080. Yeah, what are your thoughts on this one?
Yeah, it's a bit like what I've said in a few of the reviews. As sort of noted here, they are a good value option. The 3600 at $200, really hard to beat. The advantage of getting that over something like Intel's tenfold the fact that you are on the AM4 platform and you do have the option to upgrade to a Zen 3 CPU with higher IPC or higher IPC and more cores. So that's a nice upgrade path for those coming from something like a 3600, whether you buy one of those CPUs, secondhand in a few years' time or whatever. If you're on a budget for at least right now, and again, if you had to buy right now, I would urge you guys to hold off until early next year. Because perhaps at that time we will have a $220 5600, which would be a much better purchase than a $200 3600. But if you had to build right now, 3600 is a great processor to get. As we've seen, it plays all games perfectly fine, and for the most part, as I've said, you are usually pretty heavily GPU limited because most of you won't be running a 3080 or a 3090 at 1080p on a Ryzen 5 3600. Most of you will be using, I imagine, somewhere in that mid-range, like a 2060, 2070 Super, 5700, 5700 XT, somewhere in there would be the sort of the higher end graphics cards you'd be pairing with a 3600. and you're almost always going to be GPU limited at 1440p. The 3600 won't really be holding you up in many titles, unless you're talking about some old ancient game that uses a single thread like StarCraft or whatever. But all modern games run really well on the 3600. So yeah, right now Zen 2 is the value option. Really, it's kind of like a Threadripper 2nd gen, Threadripper 3rd gen type situation, where if you want a lot of cores on the cheap, you got the 2nd gen Threadripper. If you want the latest and greatest, 3rd gen. Same sort of situation here.
Yeah, I guess it depends how far Zen 2 falls in the next couple of months. Like, if you could pick up a 3600 for $150 in the next couple of months, that's going to be like a pretty good deal. And if that's,
sure,
nearly $100 less than even a 5600 non-X, if that part exists, that is a significant amount of money that could go towards like moving just one tier up in a GPU purchase. So
sure,
yeah, there's a lot to play out there. But I mean, if it comes in that they're only like, as you said, sort of $200 versus $220 for a 6-core, then that's not really getting you that GPU upgrade. So you may as well spend that little bit of extra money. It really just like with all these sort of let's predict the future questions, it really comes down to where it's positioned. And I think we've seen AMD though be pretty aggressive with dropping their price for older generation parts once the new stuff comes in and sort of availability settles on it. So it wouldn't surprise me if Zen 2 still is quite a good value buy, into next year if they continue to stock them.
Yeah, it's a similar sort of conversation. If the 3600 drops down to 150 and then you get a 5600 at 220, yeah, again, you're probably not... While I'd be tempted to get the $220 option, honestly, again, 150, probably going to be looking at the same performance in games. And that's the problem with the benchmark videos. Although I try to stress it, when we're reviewing the CPU, we're reviewing the CPU. We're trying to show you the differences between the CPUs when other factors are eliminated as much as possible. But then when you get into real-world testing, which is why I like to do the GPU-CPU scaling, which comes later because that is a huge amount of testing. But often we find, for those of you running a mid-range GPU at a 1440p type resolution, the CPU doesn't play, or the role the CPU plays there isn't nearly as significant. So you have to go much further back in time before the CPU becomes a problem. Okay, next one here. For a pure higher-end gaming system, think RTX 3080 or 6800 XT, do you think it would be better to get an 8-core 5800X or save the money with a 5600X, or 5600 it comes out, and put the money towards a Zen 4 system? So, DDR5 upgrade and all that sort of stuff. So that's basically the question. Well, I guess it depends on your budget and what you plan on doing with the system. If you're someone who, let's say you have 2 screens. This argument's been coming up a bit lately. If you have 2 screens open and for some reason you insist on trying to watch a YouTube video while you're playing a game, I couldn't imagine doing that because I usually play competitive games. But even the storytelling games you play, wouldn't that be a bizarre situation?
Yeah, it's too distracting. Don't do it. Maybe with Flight Simulator or something like that, but aside from that, not really.
Okay. Yeah, that might make sense, that sort of game. But anyway, let's say you're a weirdo that does that.
Mass unsubs, you calling these people weirdos.
All the people that don't get sarcasm or jokes, they're just mass exodus.
Yeah.
If you do other things like streaming or watching YouTube videos while you game or something else in the background that uses anywhere from an insignificant amount of CPU usage to maybe a significant amount, then those 2 extra cores could come in handy and maybe will help avoid frame stuttering. For the most part, if you're a normal person who, when they play games, they close their video encoding software and they close their 4K YouTube video. Generally, when I game, I'm gaming on a 3970X, 32 Zen 2 cores, 64 gigs of RAM, plenty of stuff. Whenever I game, I shut everything down basically, because it reduces your risk of the game crashing at some point, because that can happen, especially in certain games. And you just don't need stuff in the background while you're gaming. So I usually close most things down. I leave the web browser open with a few things. Anyway, everyone's different. But basically, I think most people will find a 5600X very sufficient for gaming because it is similar to something like a 3700X in terms of CPU resources. It just has significantly better memory and cache latency performance. So,
it's
yeah,
kind of like
I
what
would
we've been
personally...
talking about, isn't it?
Yeah, if I had a certain budget and it was like, if I was getting a 5800X and I didn't really want to cough up the extra money to make up the difference over something like a 3600X for the GPU, I would get the 5600X and get the higher end GPU that I wanted rather than shuffle around the budget to accommodate for more CPU cores that I'm possibly not going to use. But it comes down to the individual. You've really got to think about what you do with your computer. If you're the kind of person that shuts down most things, you leave Chrome open with maybe Discord and a couple of things and, I don't know, some other maybe Skype type chat program, you got Steam and maybe, you know, something else playing, and a 6-core processor will be fine. But if you're the type of gamer that you're doing mega tasking while you're gaming, you've got your 4K YouTube video playing and something else, then the extra cores might help. But anyway, sort of repeating ourselves at this point.
Yeah, I think the angle on the Zen 4 system as well is pretty interesting, because we don't really have a lot of insight into sort of what's coming in the future, and that could be a fairly substantial upgrade necessary. We're not just talking about like a drop-in CPU on your standard motherboard. It could be you need to do the full platform, motherboard, memory, and CPU. So in that sort of sense, you know, if you're saving money towards Zen 4, it might not even be worth doing a Zen 3 to Zen 4 upgrade when you sort of factor in that entire platform switch. I mean, it really depends what that CPU looks like, the sort of performance gains. But I think that for a lot of people that have invested in this Zen 3 that just came out, that if there is this platform switch, then probably you're not going to be wanting to do a single gen upgrade. So maybe if you still have the budget available, it would make more sense to just get the 5800X anyway and sort of not really think about doing that Zen 4 upgrade. But again, it really depends what sort of things we're looking at when those products are announced and all that sort of thing. But I would expect a full platform upgrade. So yeah, that's just another interesting dynamic.
It's kind of like, to change it slightly, we've been asked countless times, should I get a Ryzen 5 3600 or a Ryzen 7 3700X? And we've often said, if you're on a budget, the 3600 can't be beat. Yeah, it's usually been priced. It was like $165 when we were saying this. The $100-ish you save by getting the 6-core processor can be put towards a future upgrade. And if I had a 3600 with a mid-range GPU, I'd probably skip the 5600X, and I'd be looking at putting that $100 or so towards the Zen 4 upgrade or whatever that may be in the future.
Yep.
So, yeah, saving the money can make a difference if you are able to save money and put that money away for a future upgrade, rather than waste the extra $100 on cores that you probably aren't going to use.
All right, next question is, despite your thoughts on saying the 5800X is one of the poorer value products in the current Zen 3 lineup, do you think AMD may have gone a little too far in trying to increase their average selling price throughout their whole lineup? I personally feel that had AMD kept pricing similar with the 5600X and the 5800X, but gone a little higher with the 5900X and the 5950X, the situation wouldn't be as debatable as where it stands at the moment. So I'm really interested to hear your thoughts on it. I'll just give a couple of my thoughts on this first. I think the 5600X is enough of a compelling product that they can kind of get away with selling it at $300, especially when you sort of look at the Intel lineup and the rest of the market, you know, beating or at the very least competing with the 10600K and often higher end products makes it, well, they can just sell it for that price. That's perfectly fine. I do agree the 5800X is probably a little too expensive given what it's offering. And then, yeah, I think if they increased the price or kept that price increase, what we've got now for those higher tier parts, probably wouldn't be too much of a concern given they're more sort of your creator focused products where those people are more willing to spend more money and not necessarily, you know, the difference between $750 and $800 isn't that significant for them. But those are just my thoughts. I'm interested to hear what you have to say on this one.
Yeah, I pretty much agree with all of that. I don't think increasing the price of the higher end parts would have been a smart play. I mean, they've obviously increased them by $50, but increasing them further, yeah, I don't think that would have been the way to go, to be honest with you. The 5900X, there's no real competition for that part, so they can charge a premium, but they are charging a premium.
Yep.
And then the 5900X, that's really got to compete with the 10900K, and had that been any more expensive, then it wouldn't have been as compelling. It's still pretty hard to make an argument for buying an Intel processor given the, you know, much higher power consumption when not TDP limited, the lack of PCI Express 4.0, all that kind of stuff does make it harder to recommend the Intel CPU. But I think, you know, if you end up in a situation where Intel then becomes the value offering, it's just role reversal. basically,
Yeah.
from what we saw with Zen 2. And I don't think that's what people want to see, and that's not really a great look for AMD. The second they become very competitive, they are just go and do an Intel, which I don't believe they've done at this point. I know people are claiming they have, but I don't think they have. And yeah, I mean, it's just a market thing, isn't it? They've released these CPUs; they seem to be selling extremely well.
Yeah. That's right.
So I think they've probably nailed it, and hopefully sales do slow down though. So they look to relaunch Zen 3 with the non-X models. Hopefully that happens before long, but we'll have to wait and see.
Yeah, and I think, it's never great to see like a $50 price increase on a budget or sort of more mid-range part like a 5600X. Would have been great if that was still $250. Again, if there's a 5600 non-X, then that could smooth out that situation a bit. But personally, I think that the 5950X being that sort of, there's, as you say, there's no competition for it. Like, it's just in a realm of its own. The fact that they're only charging $800 for it when they could have done like an NVIDIA Titan thing and said, all right, well, our 5900X is a $550 or $600 CPU, whatever, and then, oh, 5950X, yeah, that's $1,200. Like, because it's sort of...
Would have left a bad taste.
It would have left a bad taste, but that's sort of what a monopoly situation can do when you've got a part that can do everything. Like, you can do Titan-type stuff. So I think the fact that they only increased it by $50 is pretty reasonable, but again, it really depends. I mean, $50 for a $750 part is a way different percentage than $50 on a $250 part. So,
yeah. Look, if it was $1,000, it would have been the 5950 XE.
yeah.
It would have been the extreme edition, and then they would have been very much like Intel. So I'm glad they didn't try and get away with that.
All right, next question is, with performance like this, what are your expectations for Threadripper 5000 series? Can the X299 platform go to the bargain bin at Kmart, or will Intel continue to flog a dead horse? Isn't it already in the bargain bin at Kmart,
yeah.
sort of?
Intel's settled into flogging that dead horse. They're going to keep doing that for a while. They don't really have too much choice, unfortunately.
Yep.
But yeah, Threadripper 5000 series is going to be brutal.
Yeah, it's going to be a beast.
Brutal. We were just talking about pricing a moment ago. I have no idea what sort of pricing adjustment we're going to be looking at there, because 3rd gen Threadripper was already a bit extreme. So not sure what to expect. I shudder to think, but yeah, 5000 series Threadripper is going to be something else. It's going to be insane.
It's going to be really great for workstation use, and I can imagine AMD already, just based on sort of the messaging they were using for the 5950X. You know, they're not going to have a situation where it's just multi-core performance. I mean, something like these big Threadripper CPUs is going to be great for pretty much everything, like your video encoding and your 3D rendering, but also modeling and stuff that really heavily relies on your single thread performance, where those Intel chips can have a bit of a lead there. So sort of your SolidWorks and stuff, while it doesn't necessarily need, you know, that many cores, some parts of those applications do also, you know, when you're doing certain tasks, can spool up across all the cores, but then, you know, during the editing process, it really relies on single thread performance. So I think for those applications, you're going to see AMD just going all out on the marketing with that sort of thing. So I envision them being quite expensive, potentially even higher, as we sort of talked about. But again, really don't know. Having 64 cores with this sort of single thread performance is going to be quite a compelling option. Very hard to compete with.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, I'm not looking forward to seeing the pricing on those ones, but anyway.
All right, next question is, given the lessons learnt from past CPU launches for AMD and motherboard manufacturers, have you come across any software/hardware compatibility issues with the Zen 3 processors? So,
You want me to answer this, Tim?
Yeah, I mean, it's probably best that someone that's actually used the CPUs answers that question.
All right, fine. No issues as of yet, which is, yeah, great to see. Having said that, I have to admit I haven't done a whole lot of testing on. Well, I mean, we've done all the software testing we've done, and so that was all fine. But as far as hardware compatibility goes, very select range of memory modules, graphics cards, and that sort of stuff. And I haven't really even tested that many motherboards. But I haven't really heard of anyone having any problems. It seems like those that bought it slotted it in and they're enjoying their CPUs. So Unless there's any major reports that I've missed, then yeah, I think it's pretty well dialed in at this point.
I think it was also interesting to see that AMD, I think maybe not learnt from compatibility related stuff, but learnt from the spec sheet and making sure that they don't maybe overestimate the frequencies that the chips run at. Because there's been quite a few reports that some of these chips will boost their single core performance or single core frequency up to 5 gigahertz when it's not advertised as a 5 gigahertz chip. So I think they definitely learnt from that respect and sort of dialed back a little bit on what they're advertising.
I think that's right as well. Having said that, I don't think that they overestimated on the spec sheet what the CPUs could do. It was just a bug in the AGESA code that they ironed out, and then it was no longer a problem, and people got their 25, 50 megahertz back. Yeah, there were some boards that were like 150 megahertz down or whatever, but they were clearly buggy boards. But anyway, it all got sorted out before long, but it was a very minor teething issue that had no real impact on the performance shown in reviews or anything like that. Continuing on from sort of motherboard testing, the next question here is, have you tested any B450 motherboards with the 5000 series CPUs yet? No. I heard rumors that I think it was Gigabyte had BIOS support for Zen 3 on their B450 boards. I have no idea if that's true. I haven't actually looked into it yet because I haven't had a chance. But no, I haven't tested any B450 motherboards yet. I asked MSI if they had a BIOS I could try for their Max boards. Nothing as of yet, so they're still talking about early next year.
Makes sense.
So not sure if that's... Yeah, we'll see if that situation changes next month, but yeah, if not, it'll be the month after. So not too long to wait for those on B450 motherboards, but again, really, they're probably doing you a favour. I say this a lot when something's delayed, that they're probably doing you a favour, but if January comes around and you end up getting that 5600 for $220 US, it's going to be a lot better value CPU for you guys hanging on to your B450 motherboards. Anyway, we'll have to wait and see what happens there. All right, question here from Nick, who's a long-time supporter, one of the OGs, I think. Anyway, how does Ryzen 5000 handle games like Microsoft Flight Sim and Metro Exodus that even at 4K had a big performance deficit on Ryzen 3000 versus Intel CPUs? Well, they didn't at 4K. 4K, the performance was identical with an RTX 3080 and 3090, so maybe you're thinking of 1440p where there was a bit of a deficit. The answer is, I don't know, but I'm tipping a lot better. So I've promised, and it will happen soon. I'll probably get through this new Radeon launch cycle. Once that's done, I promise you guys I'll do like a 30-40 game benchmark comparing Ryzen 5000 CPUs with the Intel 10th Gen CPUs. And there'll be some big GPU comparisons. The sort of stuff you often see from us, we do that after the launch cycle's over.
Yeah, in the lighter periods of the year.
In the lighter periods, I'll sit there and spend day and night benchmarking, and we'll get a heap of data, and we'll make those videos. So yeah, hopefully we can squeeze them in December. If not, it'll be early next year. But I'm aiming to do it the second I can, basically. Yep. So that's all I can really promise you.
All right, next question. This is kind of an interesting one, a bit different to some of the value and motherboard related stuff we've just been talking about. So, back in the days of Phenom, some motherboard manufacturers used to offer BIOSes with the unlock cores option, potentially giving the user to run a 3-core processor with all its 4 cores if they were lucky enough to get a CPU where the core was just disabled and otherwise fully functional. Is there any reason why this isn't an option anymore other than manufacturers not implementing it? It sounds like something that should be possible given how the CPUs are built, at least according to what you've said in the 5800X review. So I guess part of the reason is that a lot of the time these days they actually laser like the parts, so they physically cut off that part of the CPU from being used. So even if you flashed like a different, I don't know how you do this, sort of like GPU board flashing where you flash a different BIOS on it, but you flash a different like chip BIOS or code or whatever, it just wouldn't work because they've been hardware altered. And I guess in addition to that, even if it was possible and they weren't lasered, I think it'd be like a PCIe 4.0 on B450 situation where AMD would quickly get the motherboard makers to remove that feature from existing. Because with all these things, like the motherboard makers have to sign an agreement with the vendor, like AMD or Intel, to implement all the features and stuff that they're, there's all sorts of complications there with things they can and can't do. And I think that this would clearly be a situation where it would not be allowed, because they want to have their segmentation and they want to sell the 8-core processors at a higher price, and it'd be just far too complicated. And you get all sorts of like YouTube videos being like, "Oh, just buy a 5600X and then you can unlock it and it will become a 5800X," and it would just be a big mess.
Well, yeah, it's everything you said, and it's not just about the product segmentation either. I'm imagining in some instances you will appear to have enabled all the cores, but the core was actually deemed defective for a reason. So it may work in certain workloads or under certain conditions, but it's not fully functional, and it will cause crashing or system hanging or weird
errors,
stuttering problems,
output errors.
And then people have a habit of modifying a product in the way that they're not meant to, and then when it doesn't work as intended, blaming the product.
Yep, that's right.
And even if they were aware that they'd modified the product and it wasn't behaving the way they wanted, then you get people RMAing CPUs because they didn't win the silicon lottery, let's say, and it just creates endless headaches. So that's just why they don't do it. Yeah,
it makes it seem like it's a supported feature if it's in the motherboard settings, like sort of like your overclocking stuff, which it's not supported within warranty, but AMD's like, yep, okay, you're all good, we'll let you control those things. And then obviously people understand the silicon lottery, but if you've put that sort of feature in, it's like, yep, we understand that some of these chips are going to be, you're going to get a good situation there. And I think the reality is that the binning process has probably come a long way since then as well, so you'd probably be a lot less likely to get a properly working chip if you did it. So yeah, plenty of reasons why they avoid that situation.
All right, another question here. Have you seen any instances of the lower core parts outdoing the higher core parts in games where there is enough load for the cores to get loaded, leading to a lower frequency in the higher core parts, as reported by GN? Not 100% sure on that. Basically, I have seen the parts that are limited to a single CCD performing slightly better in very sensitive, latency-sensitive titles such as Far Cry New Dawn. I'm not sure how much of that is due to clock frequency. I imagine it's more the fact that all the cores are located within a single CCD. But that's really all I can say on that one. For the most part, the performance is very similar. Like we're talking very insignificant differences in test conditions that aren't necessarily super real world.
Yeah, I think in the AMD review guide and that sort of thing, I mean, we never want to go entirely on AMD's review guide, but their expectation generally is that you will see a few games where potentially the 5600 is the fastest chip, or the 5600X, sorry, and the 5800X as well, but in a lot of the situations it's much of a muchness, and that's sort of what you found with your review. It's more to do with do you have one or two chiplet dies on your chip or not. That's kind of the big performance factor, and beyond that, it's kind of they all perform pretty similarly, which is great for gaming perforence. Allows you to buy allows you to buy the lowest part you possibly can and still get all the gaming performance. But it's an interesting theory. I have to go and watch some of the GN videos and see what they're saying on that. But it would be an interesting situation if a game was really frequency sensitive, but then it loaded a lot of the cores as well, so caused a frequency reduction. I'm sure there are situations where something like that is possible, so you would get a benefit from having fewer cores, but I guess that would be sort of offset by situations where the opposite would happen, like, you need the extra cores, or it needs this high single thread frequency, or whatever the situation is. So,
okay, last question here from Ibslice, who's a long-time supporter of Hardware Unboxed, and his question is, if I was to go from a 3900X to a 5800X, even though your video was a don't buy it, it's still better per dollar than the 3900X, and performance is above the 3900X. So he's saying the 5800X is faster and technically better value. So in that instance, it would be a worthwhile upgrade. Or would it be a worthwhile upgrade? If you're just gaming, I mean, I guess I'd refer to sort of stuff I've already said, that in the case of Ibslice, I know he has a 2080 Ti and he targets 1440p gaming. Even with the 2080 Ti, really in most games, you're going to be more GPU limited than CPU limited. There will be a few instances where you'll see a small performance uplift, but it's not going... the performance or the cost per frame isn't going to equal out to what we show in our review because you're not using a 3090 at 1080p. You're using a 2080 Ti at 1440p. So really, the upgrade there is going to be pretty insignificant. Yeah, some games will be a little bit faster. Most will be about the same. Not worth it.
Yeah.
You're with the 3090, you are definitely better off waiting and seeing what we get with Zen 4.
Yeah.
So and hopefully in that situation, sorry to interrupt you, Tim. Hopefully in that instance, you would also have an upgrade path. The problem with jumping from a 3090 to a 5800X is that, or a 3900X, sorry, to a 5800X is the fact that there is no upgrade path. So it's a very minute upgrade, and you're also not getting anything after that.
Yeah, it's one of those situations where you'd make that upgrade if your sort of setup had changed. Like, for example, you'd swapped out the 2080 Ti for a 3090 or an even more powerful GPU. If you suddenly had a change of heart and were like, yeah, 1080p competitive gaming, that's my thing now, or you're playing a lot of competitive titles, then you would make that change first and then go, oh, okay, well, now my CPU is becoming the more limiting factor. So then that sort of minor side grade type upgrade becomes a more viable thing. Whereas I guess, as we've been talking more about his setup here, very much in the don't upgrade that sort of path, because it's still an expensive part and you still have already bought the 3900X, so it's not a situation where you're sort of choosing between, do I buy a 3900X or do I buy a 5800X? You've already got it, so you spend, it's like an additional investment that you might get some back from selling the CPU secondhand or whatever. So yeah, it's with those Zen 2 to Zen 3 upgrades, I think a lot of people find that waiting or not upgrading is better, but then for anything below that, very much you're going to get a significant upgrade. So that's what we've been saying all along.
Yeah, I think you've nailed that one. Really, the only time it would make sense is if you've got a 3600 or lower, and as you say, your situation's changed now, and you either want to do competitive type gaming or some sort of productivity task that can take advantage of the more cores, then going up to, in that instance, you'd probably still want to be jumping up quite significantly to like a 5900X, which is obviously a big difference in CPU price. But in the case of someone like Ibslice, who has a 2080 Ti, who targets 1440p, who isn't a competitive gamer, he plays sort of your Assassin's Creed, Division 2, all those sort of games that you play as well, predominantly single player games, then I would be sticking with 5900X for sure.
Yeah, I think we end up saying this pretty much with every generation. It's like, on the CPU side, your single generation upgrades is very rarely going to be worth it unless you're doing like a big tier change, like changing from buying Ryzen 5 to buying Ryzen 9 or something like that, where you can see an upgrade. But if you're buying within the same segment, it doesn't make a lot of sense for people to do those upgrades. Whereas I tend to say that it makes more sense to do like a single gen GPU upgrade a lot of the time, because you're going to get, I mean, recently you're not going to get significant gains, but previously, I mean, potentially you could get like a 20 or 30% gain in a single generation on the GPU front. So it makes a lot more sense to sort of save your money, not do a 3900 to 5800X upgrade and spend potentially 500 plus Australian dollars and put that towards a single gen GPU upgrade, and you get a pretty much better experience in games. So that tends to be what I think, at least. So yeah.
Okay, that is going to do it for this random Ryzen 5000 series video. Hopefully you guys enjoyed the discussion. There was some good answers in there to your questions. As I said, soon I will have a memory-related Ryzen 5000 video, followed by an IPC video. And then shortly after that, there may be some new Radeon GPUs that we'll have to look at as well. So, yeah, as usual, I'm flat out. Tim's just sitting back, reviewing a monitor here and there, enjoying life.
Yeah, it's always fun. I mean, there's been a lot of stuff going on in the background. As you've seen, we've just launched Floatplane for us as an example. So there's been lots of stuff going into getting that ready. So I guess it's a good place to pitch it if you're you're not already signed up a member and you want to ask questions for some of these future Q&As that we're doing based on Discord questions, then you've got the option now, either Patreon or Floatplane. So that's been really exciting for us, and yeah, it's been good to get a bit of a break. It's good to have you slaving away at some benchmarks and making content, so I can focus on getting some of this stuff out in addition to monitor reviews. Tiger Lake, I've got Tiger Lake systems in finally, so we'll be able to do some updated Intel laptop stuff, which is good. And yeah, fun stuff.
Yeah, I joke, of course. Tim's always working hard on something. There's always something to do, isn't there?
Oh, as
So you
always,
never-
the list of ideas, it's always, you're doing like 20 Zen 3 reviews. I'm like, oh, but I've got like a full schedule of my own videos I want to do, and you're doing like 5 videos a week. So yeah, it's always busy,
Yeah.
always stuff to cover. Lots of fun being a tech
Yeah.
reviewer, especially at the moment. Lots of
It is
crazy
a lot of
stuff to
fun,
cover.
yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, yeah, I think that's pretty much going to do it for this one. So thank
Yep.
you to everyone who asked a question. Of course, thank you to everyone who watched this video. Thank you to everyone who gave it a like. And yeah, if you're not subscribed, make sure you are, because as I said, a lot more content coming. And Tim will probably do a video soon as well.
Very soon. Well, I'll be editing this one, so I guess that sort of counts in a small way, doesn't it?
It does.
All right.
All right, guys. Thank you very much for watching. I'm your host, Steve.
I'm yours, Tim. We'll see you
See you next
in
time.
the next one.